The Internet Society is a global organization dedicated to fighting for the future of the Internet. As the DC chapter of that organization, we like to foster vital discussions about important Internet-related topics, such as this one. We're very enthusiastic about tonight's panel. We have a great subject and the best panelists possible for it. Thank you all very much for coming. I don't want to take too much of your time, so with that, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Timothy Lee, who is the Economics and Technology lead correspondent for Vox.com. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Oh, cool. All right, Timothy, thank you.
Thank you. So do I need this microphone and my? All right, thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you all for coming. My name's Tim Lee. As you said, I write about a number of topics, including Bitcoin, for Vox.com, and I'm happy to be with you all here. I want to talk a little bit about where the Bitcoin ecosystem is, what the state of the regulatory situation is here, since we have some experts on that. And I was wondering if I'd like Jim Angel to start. He's a professor at the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown. Give us kind of an overview of where the Bitcoin ecosystem is and what its prospects for success in the coming years is.
Why, thank you. First of all, let me check out the crowd here. How many of you have ever made a transaction in Bitcoin? Okay. How many of you have never heard of Bitcoin before? Okay, so we've got a nice broad spectrum. Well, first of all, I have to confess, I am a bit skeptic about the future of Bitcoin 1.0. That if you're looking for that libertarian dream of a currency that is beyond the control of any government, that you can buy any illicit substance you want, and that no government can ever mess with, that ain't going to happen. Bitcoin 1.0 is a disruptive technology, but this is the Internet Society. How many of you remember BitNet? BitNet was a protocol for linking computers before the Internet, but the Internet protocol surpassed it. How many of you have a computer? How many of you have an Altair computer? Okay, so you can see that first movers of disruptive technologies are not necessarily the long-term winners. And I think Bitcoin 1.0 is the same. It's a disruptive technology, it's a major technological advance, but as a currency to replace the existing currencies on the planet, I think it has too many challenges to overcome. One of these is the network effect of existing currencies. That there are many products out there, like computer operating systems, that the more people who use it, the more people who want to use it. Currencies are the same. There's a network effect. Payment systems also are networks. And the real way to think about Bitcoin is not as a currency, but as a payment system. And that's very important because what is beautiful about Bitcoin is that it is fundamentally an open architecture payment system. So unlike a closed network like a Visa or a MasterCard where you have monopolies or duopolies, you basically have a system that a competitive network of miners can plug in and process. And what that means is it will push the cost of processing down to the competitive level. It is an open architecture payment system, and that's one of the things that is really cool, not only technologically, but also economically about Bitcoin. But it's more. It is also a public ledger. The way Bitcoin works is you do a transaction, you post it to the internet, and the miners do their crypto mumbo, as I call it, or crypto jumbo, to basically verify that nobody has double spent that Bitcoin, and they're publicly moving it from one address to another. So it is actually a public ledger. And if anybody finds out your address, they can find out all the payments you've made to and from other addresses. But that's not a bug, that's a feature. And indeed, that's one of the applications for blockchain technology. One of the things NASDAQ is doing is they have a really cool proposal to actually use blockchain technology to transfer and record the ownership of stock in private companies. Currently, for private companies, they basically keep track of shareholdings essentially with quill pens and parchment. And what NASDAQ is proposing to do is to set up a blockchain system using blockchain technology that would, allow people to transfer stock in private companies like your startup from one shareholder to another and have it processed electronically. So there's a lot of promise to blockchain technology, even though as a currency, Bitcoin 1.0 has a lot of challenges. For example, governments are not going to want to have their currencies replaced because governments make a lot of money printing money. Furthermore, as far as regulation goes, there are some really good reasons why we demand regulation of financial services. We want to make sure that our money isn't stolen from our bank account. We want to make sure that the financial system doesn't disappear on us and bring down the economy. So any long-lasting currency/payment system has to have political control from the people. So having something that's run by an algorithm, well, we learned in the 19th century, if you study monetary history, just how bad a fixed monetary policy was. But I probably used up more than my 3 minutes of time. But I'll just say one last challenge to Bitcoin 1.0, and that's the environmental challenge. The amount of electricity needed to generate new Bitcoins, is actually pretty large. The amount of electricity needed to do all that crypto is pretty large. So if Bitcoin were to become, the payment medium of the planet, the electricity required would be huge. And so I think this kind of technology, as we go to Bitcoin 2.0 or altcoin N.N or BitDollar N.N, I think we need to have better protocols that are more energy efficient. And with that, I will turn it over.
All right, thank you. So next I'd like to hear from John Collins of Coinbase. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this question of, is Bitcoin the technology that's going to really take over the world, or, what do you think about this idea that there might be sort of fatal flaws that, might be supplanted by some other technology? And also talk a little bit about what you see as the kind of practical killer apps that, 10, 15 years from now, hopefully, Coinbase is based on the idea that this is going to be a really big technology. What are consumers actually going to be doing with Bitcoin that they're currently doing with other technologies, or are there new things that they can't do at all that they're going to be able to do in the future?
Right. So I'll talk a little bit about sort of who Coinbase is and sort of what we do in this space while we're excited about Bitcoin, and then I'll probably get to those questions. So Coinbase is what's called a universal services Bitcoin company, and I can talk a little bit about what that means. But basically, our driving mission is to make Bitcoin as easy as possible for the average person, average consumer, average merchant to use. We have a number of different products in that vein to make that happen. But we're based in San Francisco, 70 employees out there, 30 worldwide, doing customer support, compliance, and other functions. Venture funded, $106 million in investment at this point. Our last round included New York Stock Exchange, USAA, BBVA, among other major financial institutions. The first Bitcoin company to achieve major investment from traditional financial players, which we're really proud of. People ask me sort of why did the New York Stock Exchange and BBVA and others decide to invest in a company that does Bitcoin? And it's very clear that these companies see the potential, and they're not investing in Bitcoin, the currency, or in the asset, but they're investing in companies like Coinbase and others that are really focused on building the infrastructure to make the blockchain and to make this distributed technology valuable to people. And why we're excited about it is because it's a global open access system. We think about the internet, it's made up of a number of different protocols that allow you to do different things. It's not a single state. And we view this to be a protocol that allows for distributed record keeping, the first application of which is payments. If you think about the way payments work today via automated clearinghouse through your bank account, or the way microtransactions work or don't work, the fees that come with some payments, either with international remittances or even just sort of your average day-to-day payment. It's expensive and it's slow and it's not that efficient. We think there's a lot of potential for Bitcoin to solve some of those problems, to make it faster, cheaper, more efficient, and global. In terms of sort of the fatal flaws, I guess, with the protocol, I'll differ a little bit with Jim on that, and I'm sure Peter has some thoughts on this as well. Whether or not I do, there's a lot of talk about altcoins, and I don't want to get into sort of these other sort of protocols that have been developed. Our position is, at this point, they're kind of a distraction. I mean, Bitcoin is the first protocol to be developed in the same way that SMTP and other protocols, where the development, the investment money, the brain power is being put onto that protocol. The very fact that it's open source allows for those flaws or other sort of weaknesses that will develop over time to be fixed. And it's our belief that that will happen, and it will adapt as it grows. In terms of sort of these kind of killer applications, I think there are a number of different things that distributed record keeping via the blockchain can do. Some of them are way down. I was talking to someone today actually who is at Rowan University who just wrote a paper comparing the early days of the internet to where we are with Bitcoin. And I was like, if you could tell the future and kind of tell where we are versus sort of where we are with the internet, what year are we in? And he said 1995. There are probably solutions that the blockchain can, or products that the blockchain can help create that we haven't even thought of. In the same way that 1995, you probably never thought of ordering a black car on your cell phone that you can today. But the killer applications that we see now are mostly related to payments. This idea of it basically being a non-proprietary Visa network, an open access Visa or MasterCard network. And so two of the things that we talk a lot about and that we think are probably things you're going to see probably in the next year or two are international remittances and microtransactions. It's very, very expensive and very slow to send money via international remittances, Western Union, MoneyGram, et cetera. I think they see the writing on the wall related to this technology that it could be very disruptive to their business models. So I think you're going to see applications of the blockchain and Bitcoin in general to make those faster and cheaper for people. I think the second piece is microtransactions, and I'll just use publishing as an example, but there are a number of other examples. You pay $25 or whatever you pay for your New York Times subscription because it doesn't make sense. The payment networks don't support a 5-cent per article fee to be taken out of your Visa or MasterCard account. If you had a seamless way in which a digital wallet could be debited 5-10 cents at a time for every article that you read or every blog post that you take in, that Bitcoin, because of the way in which it functions, allows for that kind of model to be sustainable. Whereas, again, with the fees, with traditional payment networks, it's just not. So I think microtransactions are a way in which, when we view sort of the future of the internet, it's an entirely different way of viewing how you can monetize content and frankly fund content creators. And we think that's something that is probably something we're really working on as an application in the next year or two.
All right, thank you. Next, we've got Catherine Pelker from the FBI. And one of the things I'm really interested in hearing about is kind of the nuts and bolts. So a couple years ago, we had, there's some Senate hearings and stuff about how the Bitcoin ecosystem would interact with law enforcement, but it was kind of a theoretical discussion. And now I think we've had enough. We've had the experience with Silk Road and other cases of actually doing law enforcement with regard to the blockchain. And I'm curious if you can give us a little sense of how that's going, how kind of law-abiding is the ecosystem and the companies, and what kind of challenges is law enforcement facing?
Sure. So I work on money laundering for the FBI, and so my job will encompass looking at all of the different ways that any FBI subject is moving or disguising their money. So on a given day, as you can imagine, a lot of our targets can be incredibly creative in how they hide their funds. So I might be looking at a Ponzi scheme that's hiding funds in real estate, a sanctioned entity that's stripping out bank wires, people actually physically carrying around suitcases full of cash, or what brings us all here today, much more technically sophisticated measures that some of our more sophisticated criminals do use to move and hide their money. And all of that comes from a perspective of trying to follow the money through any different criminal scheme. And we do that for a number of reasons. We want to build out the full network. We want to know who our subjects are dealing with, who their criminal associates are, where victims' funds are actually being held, siphoned off to, helps further the overall investigation. And we want to be able to do that regardless of the form that value or those funds take, whether it's cash, cryptocurrency, casino chips, real estate, or the like. And what we know is that criminals are early adopters really of any new technology and financial technologies in particular. So we saw back in really the late 1990s, our cyber criminals start to use what at the time were centralized virtual currency systems, your Liberty Reserves, web money, and the like, because it really was an easy, well-supported platform for them to move their value. And we saw that really evolve in the decade from there, and then Bitcoin emerged as both a supplement to that and then also an alternative, so that it was a new way for people, legitimate consumers, to move money. And our criminals were very, very quick to recognize that and figure out how many of the benefits that legitimate consumers see in Bitcoin could also be used to advance many of the different criminal goals. So I think over the last 5 years, what we've really seen is a development in how criminals are moving their funds, both in traditional financial systems, but now using different online-based payment systems to include Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, as well as the continued dominance of more centralized online payment systems. And that really has become much more prevalent, both as far as the instances of criminals using them, and then also the breadth of different types of criminal activity. So it used to be that if you were going to use any centralized virtual currency system, you really were a fairly sophisticated cyber criminal. You were active on a certain number of criminal forums. You were already doing most of your business online. It wasn't that we had our traditional physical world criminals or financial fraudsters moving into that realm. We saw it expand into individuals dealing in child pornography, perpetrators of some very specialized financial frauds, but it really wasn't until the last 5 years that we started to really see virtual currency become much more approachable to your average criminal. And a lot of that just is that the systems are much more user-friendly, they're much more ubiquitous, more popular, so it's very natural that our criminals will actually have heard of them and be inclined to experiment with them, try them out. Also, it's that it's a younger generation of criminals coming into prevalence in their organizations. They have more of a say in how things are run, and they're very comfortable doing business online. We've also, though, have seen more sophistication in how they use these systems. And a lot of this has drawn a lot of press attention for Bitcoin specifically. But what we see it as just a continuation of centuries worth of trends where anyone who's committing a crime, normally there's some sort of financial nexus there, whether it's a financial motivation, they commit the crime to make money, or they have to pay for something related to their crime. And since the beginning of history, they needed a way to be able to hide that activity, and they were always very early adopters looking for the next new great way to be able to move money. And so we continue to see that trend move over regardless of what the different payment platform is. I think that the more interesting thing is just how the actors are able to actually capitalize on what are commonly touted as a lot of the benefits of Bitcoin, and how they're able to use that essentially to their advantage. So the disintermediation of the transactions, you don't have a middleman. It makes the transactions much more seamless. From the criminal's perspective, that means that there's no one there who could potentially be looking at their transactions. Now the trade-off, though, is that you have a fully transparent transaction ledger, so you can actually go and look at all of their transactions. So it's really the question of linking it back to a real-world identity where the challenge for law enforcement comes in. You know, the interconnected global nature of the Bitcoin network and how you can really send transactions fairly seamlessly with very little regard to borders. Much more reflective both of a modern economy, but also of any modern criminal network where you're usually not limited to any one physical geographic location. And then we see that criminals are getting much smarter as far as how they're actually routing their transactions. And we see this evolve with early traditional financial mechanisms of, criminals have figured out how they can manipulate the banking system to set up shell companies, strip wires, evade a lot of the controls that the banks will have in place to detect criminal activity. And our criminals are doing the same things now with Bitcoin, of even though at this point most of them are using exchangers on some level to cash in, cash out, and they either are able to find exchanges that are operating in regimes where they don't have the same controls that, say, Coinbase might have in place, or they are able to use fraudulent information to trick some of the controls that an exchange might put in place to open up the accounts. And then they often now take a lot of different, more sophisticated steps to move their money within the system.
All right, thank you. That was very helpful. So our last speaker is Peter van Valkenburgh, who's with Coincenter. And I was wondering if you could give us an overview of the kind of regulatory landscape. So one piece is the law enforcement anti-money laundering piece, but there's also some state level stuff that's more focused on consumer protection. And maybe you can tell us if there's anything else I'm not thinking about.
Sure. So just as an introduction, Coincenter is a nonprofit research and advocacy center that's based here in DC. For those of you who are familiar with internet advocacy, you can kind of think of us to the blockchain and to Bitcoin what EFF and CDT have been to the internet. It's something we aspire to be at the very least, because it's very early days for the blockchain. But there were some key battles that were fought in regulation in the early days of the internet. Among them, the Communications Decency Act shielded intermediaries from defamation liability, so it's difficult to sue Google if they show a search result that's defamatory. And the Digital Millennium Copyright Act really created a way to make copyright manageable for intermediaries. And there were other battles as well, like a finding that computer code is protected speech under the First Amendment, which is a watershed moment for people who want to be able to release new innovations and not worry about whether they can be restrained before that. So those important battles were fought. We can always, be a Monday morning quarterback and say that things could have been better, things could have been worse, but I think a lot of good was done. And our somewhat humble goal is to try and do some of the good that will happen as far as promoting innovation on cryptocurrency going forward by trying to create a rational regulatory structure that wouldn't impinge on innovation. So that said, talking about the regulatory landscape for Bitcoin right now is it's sort of a game of whack-a-mole for us right now. And there's some players in the ecosystem that have made it easier for us, some agencies that were out in front on Bitcoin and helped to set a tone and helped to create some legitimacy by creating a legal framework that made sense, that made important companies like Coinbase comfortable that they could operate without worrying about a knock on their door one day. Among them, say, FinCEN and the Department of Treasury, which is their umbrella organization or umbrella department, made it clear when, the Bank Secrecy Act, which is what law we look to for anti-money laundering standards, when and how that should apply to a company that's using Bitcoin. And that guidance in 2013 was kind of a great moment. It provided some legitimization and it provided some clear standards as to what needs to be done, and I think that's very important. There's still ongoing debates as to how exactly you build a compliance regime that would work with Bitcoin and with what FinCEN demands, but that's the kind of process we want, which is a measured one that doesn't involve too many surprises where one side thought someone was saying something and the other side thought something else. Because I really think, and this is our mission at Coincenter, we can reconcile the policy goals and the statutory obligations under the law that, say, the FBI has or that FinCEN has, with a flourishing ecosystem of blockchain innovation, which, as we've discussed, many of us believe is the future of finance and maybe the future of the internet as the two sort of merge and you sort of have this seamless web of content and payments. The state level is really where when I mentioned whack-a-mole, where we're dealing a lot right now. You probably or possibly heard of the BitLicense process. It's been the most visible regulatory action in recent times when it comes to Bitcoin. The BitLicense is a regulation that's being promulgated by the New York Department of Financial Services, which is the consumer protective agency in New York State for money transmitters, for banks, for financial intermediaries. Consumer protection is different than AML. It's about solvency. It's about whether the place where you're storing your money is actually a legit organization and they're not going to suddenly shutter their doors and leave you out of luck. So it makes sense, especially in the wake of some of the early security failures within intermediaries in Bitcoin like Mt. Gox, that the New York Department of Financial Services would decide that they need to step in and take a role in the Bitcoin ecosystem that's analogous to the role they play with Western Union or analogous to the role they play with a bank that they regulate as a chartered bank in the state of New York. So the BIT license was this attempt to draft a law that would operationalize that. And they have authority from the New York legislature to do that. And they've moved forward with a regulatory process that's had several drafts. And we've had many organizations, ourselves included, that have commented on those drafts and tried to get the provisions to be innovation friendly and yet still achieve the statutory obligations and policy goals of the regulators. Ben Lawsky's made it a fairly public process. I think someone on his staff coined the term BIT license, which is a lot better than saying something like AB 1326, which is the bill in California. At least it reads much better in a Vox headline. But there are other states that have been involved too. It's quite possible we'll see the final draft of the BIT license come out tomorrow. There's been a tweet as of about an hour ago. This is breaking news. That for a very small subset of people is extremely exciting and maybe worrisome. And so we'll be waiting for that tomorrow. Just as a quick rundown of what we might see there, there's things that you would normally expect in money transmission law, like you have to have a surety bond in order to potentially use that to reimburse customers if you were to fail one day or be hacked. But what's more worrisome about the New York proposal is for the first time ever, Ben Lawsky's decided to put AML, anti-money laundering requirements from a state level onto his company, onto the companies in his state. And it's not just the companies in his state, it's companies that it's companies that have New York customers. So really it's going to be potentially any internet-based company. And that's unprecedented. So traditionally, money transmission law at a state-by-state level is all about consumer protection, and we look to the federal government to do anti-money laundering because they have the resources, they have the expertise. And it also, in the New York situation, if you have, say, 50 different regimes with slightly different tweaks as far as what the legal requirements are, it makes compliance with record keeping, with suspicious activity reporting, into a bespoke regime that you must craft for customers in all different jurisdictions. They already have that problem, and people who are, value the internet already understand this problem because we have this problem internationally, but this would compound it even within the US into a 50-state situation. So that's worrisome to us. California's been, I think, much more encouraging. There's none of that AML that's been shoehorned in. And the other thing that we care most about at Coincenter is to make sure that when these definitions, so when the statutory language is crafted, some of you may be familiar with ECPA, which is the sort of the closest thing the US has to a vaguely umbrella-like Electronic Privacy Act, although it's not all that comprehensive as compared to, say, the European Union. ECPA is drafted with all kinds of weird phrases in it that make no sense given the way the internet looks today. That's because it was drafted by people who were perhaps presumptuous as to the technology and where it would go, and also felt the need to quickly regulate a nascent technology. And it's really not a good regime. It doesn't deliver on privacy, and it also creates burdens on companies for compliance. Our goal is to get the definitions in these state statutes or these state regulations to not look so outdated when we, or probably me, look at them 5 years later and just cry at what I suggested and how stupid that is. So the big definitional question with a consumer protection regulatory regime at the state level is who needs to be registered, or licensed rather, in order to be able to operate in the state, and who doesn't. And it's very important with Bitcoin, because as we've discussed, Bitcoin is an open source technology. It's really a network protocol. So it's similar to TCP/IP. And it's as if you created a regulatory structure in 1990 that said TCP/IP businesses will need to be licensed. Well, you say, well, that's a huge category with many subsets of different businesses that are involved in different aspects of this nascent technology. What we're worried about with Bitcoin businesses is that really the only people who should have consumer protection regulations imposed upon them are the people who pose a consumer protection risk. So somebody who's a coder who's building software that they think could create an identity system using the blockchain to create irreversible records of somebody's credentials online, and so that they can log in more easily in an open network, that person's not holding consumer funds like a Western Union or like a bank. They're not really inside of this regulatory regime you're trying to craft to protect consumer funds. Make sure that there's no definitional section that sweeps them in, forces them to bear what are very often extremely costly compliance costs. You have to hire a lawyer, you have to make several applications to 50 different states, and then there's also the possibility of having a surety bond. Make sure those entities, even if maybe they do utilize a currency in their business, but they don't hold consumer funds, make sure that they're not regulated. The process in California has been we've been very hopeful about it, because we've managed to get some really clear exemptions for people who are just writing software. They don't have to license. We don't have to get people who are contributing computing power or connectivity on the peer-to-peer network to license, because they're just relays. They're not holding consumer funds. So it's these, and I hope I haven't bored you all, it's these nitty-gritty issues of how the law intersects with a nascent technology that is our bread and butter these days, and there's a lot of it. And we just hope that in 5 years we'll look back and say, at least we had that, and that worked out, and it could have been worse.
All right, thank you. John Collins, I want to go back to you. There's been a fair amount of discussion, I think, about the international Bitcoin scene. The New York Times a few weeks ago had a piece about Bitcoin in Argentina and how that was being used to evade currency controls. Can you talk a little bit about, I assume you guys do some business globally, kind of to what extent is the U.S. ahead or behind other countries, and what sort of applications are you seeing abroad that as compared to here?
Yeah, so our wallet, so we do really three main things at Coinbase. One is merchant processing, where we help businesses who want to accept Bitcoin payments accept those payments. So that's Overstock.com, Expedia, Dell. Those are some of our largest merchants. We have 39,000 total. Many of them are very small, mom and pop coffee shops, that kind of thing. The second main core business that we do is basically, again, our driving mission to make Bitcoin as easy as possible. The average person wants to know how to get Bitcoin. We have a buy and sell platform where you can buy and sell Bitcoin. The third piece that we have is our Bitcoin wallet, which if you come to our site, you can open up a Bitcoin wallet and be able to send and receive Bitcoin via that wallet. I won't get into. Peter touched a little bit on the different wallet models. It's what we call sort of a hosted wallet model. So in the same way that you go to, and again, this kind of gets back to our excitement about Bitcoin, global open access system, in the same way that you might use Gmail or Yahoo because it's the email vendor or company that you like the functionality for, we are a Bitcoin wallet company that we host that Bitcoin for you so that you can access it via the web or on your mobile application, wherever you are. The wallet is international, so that is open, as the Bitcoin network is, to anyone across the globe. The buy and sell platform is in the United States as well as in about 20 European countries at this point. And we have an exchange, which is a buy and sell kind of spot exchange with bids and asks. That is operational in about half the states here in the United States right now, and the UK, which we just launched a few weeks ago. So in terms of the business that we do and sort of what we've seen from internationally, I will say the FinCEN guidance was actually very forward-thinking. Now, looking back, it was March 2013, which doesn't seem like a long time ago, but it actually kind of was. And, I think what we wrestle with in the EU specifically is that, and why we like the FinCEN guidance, in that it gave some clarity and certainty for how our businesses should operate. They said you need to register as a money service business, you need to get money transmitter licenses in the states where you want to operate an exchange, you need to follow the BSA. European states have wrestled with how to approach that. Some countries like Germany are very, very reticent to I think, give our business and our industry sort of a path forward. Other countries have been more forward-thinking. Our concern is that we think, and our ask really is that we believe we should be put under some sort of anti-money laundering regime EU-wide, because what we worry about is that you're going to have, as this grows, European states sort of pop up with different regimes, which will make it very difficult for us to do compliance. And kind of going to Peter's point about what we deal with in the States, we're trying to avoid that. And specifically, we don't want different anti-money laundering regimes propping up in individual European states because it makes our compliance efforts less effective, and we think it makes it less effective for regulators. I will say, though, that in the past few months, the UK has actually really come out with some pretty forward-thinking guidance and at least rhetoric at this point related to digital currencies. So the two things that they, not only have they sort of put us under sort of what their kind of BSA, their anti-money laundering, which we're very supportive of, but they actually invested money into digital currency research at the government level, and have actually put together with their Standards Institute a task force of sorts, I guess, with that Standards Institute and with industry players in the UK to develop consumer protection and other standards for the industry to follow. That sort of public and private partnership, we think, is incredibly valuable, not only for our industry, but also for, we think, folks in government to sort of share not only our expertise, but I think regulator concerns and come up with a framework that not only gives regulators confidence, but gives our businesses certainty, and I think gives ultimately our consumers confidence in the products that we're offering. So that's what I'd say on in terms of kind of what we've seen that have been really forward-thinking internationally. In terms of applications, again, it's tough to say. I know Nathaniel Popper had that article in the New York Times a few weeks ago with Argentina. Certainly, the focus on developing nations, going back to sort of the point related to the volatility of Bitcoin, I don't think it's our belief that Bitcoin will ever be less volatile than the dollar, but it could be less volatile than some international currencies, certainly. So that's something I think we look towards in the future as a possible use case. But right now, I think in the developing nations, the international remittances piece is pretty kind of front and center with a lot of folks in industry in terms of what they see as sort of the next gen application.
Okay, great. Catherine, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the ways in which Bitcoin is similar and different from previous digital payment systems. I mean, you sort of touched on this in your remarks where you were saying that the previous systems, there was always one company that owned the network, and you could go to that company and say, who owns this address, and sees the funds, and so forth. And we now have a network that isn't owned by anybody, and you have to talk to a company like Coinbase to get some identity information, but they might not even control the funds. To what extent is that in practice a big difference in the kind of difficulty law enforcement has? And what fraction of the kind of Bitcoin ecosystem do you see behaving in what I assume Coinbase is sort of presumably like on the good actor side? How often do you, when you are trying to track down a sequence of transactions, you end up at a company where you can get cooperation versus a company that's maybe somewhere overseas that's outside of U.S. jurisdiction or just not helpful?
So Bitcoin is definitely unique in that it's a decentralized payment system. It's not as though there's no one-stop shop for us to go and find the funds, as you mentioned. That said, the general process of tracking payments from whether it's one address or one bank account to the next and following the chain, in some ways, Bitcoin makes that easier because I can go to the blockchain, I can look in this perfectly transparent transaction ledger and go and look up every single transaction that's ever occurred, as opposed to if it were, say, bank wires, I might be able to go to one bank and see some and then have to follow it to the next bank, go to the next. I might be able to subpoena the overall payment system and get a better picture, but it's still very fragmented step by step. With the centralized virtual currency systems, sure, ideally I'd have a one-stop shop. I could go get all the payment information. Our criminals really would never use one of the systems that was going to respond to our legal process and give that information back to us. They're almost all set up in countries, or they purport to be set up in countries with very lax AML regimes, and then they have complex, convoluted, obfuscated ownership structures, so it's very difficult to actually determine where the company even really is, and that may be completely different than where the servers are, where the information is. And so that portion has carried over a bit into the Bitcoin space, in that we have exchangers that operate in a very similar fashion. They set themselves up in places that can be difficult for us to get to, or difficult for us to even figure out where they are. And while it's great to have this transparent transaction ledger, that's really only as valuable as the other information that we can tie to it. So all we're really getting from the blockchain is, we'll get your addresses, we'll get a date and timestamp and amount, but there's no information really inherent in the blockchain about what else is going on with that transaction. So when we start to approach it, it's normally that we have a subject that we know is using Bitcoin, or we know about a subject's address, but we might not know where those funds are, whether they're held, in cold storage, if they're on his own device, if they're with a wallet hosting provider. And then to try and trace it out where it goes from there, we have to go through the blockchain and we have to be able to know something else about some of the key addresses there to know when it even hits an exchanger or wallet hosting provider or somewhere else where there might be a company there that we can go to with legal process to get the customer identifying information. And that's still assuming that that company has the information that we're asking for. As far as what percentage of transactions or volume of transactions we are able to do that for successfully, or what we see as legitimate versus illicit, we get this question a lot of, what do we see, what percentage of Bitcoin transactions are tied to criminal activity versus what's legitimate. It's really, really difficult to say, and even if you could quantify it, what we see is that any figure would really be artificially inflated, because as a legitimate customer, even if you value your privacy, you might send your funds from, say, your Coinbase wallet back onto a wallet that you're holding offline on your own device in cold storage. It may go through an additional couple hops, but it's a more or less direct transaction path. If you're someone who's really trying to obscure and hide your identity, you probably send it through a tumbler or a mixing service. It's going through an incredibly ornate set of different transactions. So the number of addresses it gets routed through is really much more significant, so that if you were looking at number of illicit transactions, that may not actually match as far as the real volume of the illicit activity. So it's just really, really difficult to quantify and say.
Okay, sounds good. All right, I want to open it up to questions from the audience. Do we want to be passing a microphone around?
Yes, please.
Yes, please. Okay, so, yes, somebody could, all right. Anybody have a question? Right here. Wait for the microphone.
Thank you. As you were talking about monitoring activity, this is FBI question. I know that FinCEN, for example, is notorious for having incredibly complex algorithms for detecting criminal or activity that may flag itself as potentially illicit. Have you all developed similar tools with regard to analyzing and monitoring the blockchain activity on a streaming basis?
Sure, so this actually might be a good question for John as well, where some of the things that we do as far as looking at blockchain on a macro level, usually it's that if we're tracing a transaction, we're looking at, it may not be address to address, but it's tied to a particular activity as opposed to monitoring this giant set of customer transactions. Where it does come into play, though, is with the exchanges or any businesses that have these anti-money laundering or compliance obligations, as far as their monitoring for their customers and the red flags that they build out and then extrapolate it onto the network as a whole. So I don't mean to punt it, but...
Yeah, no, I'll just say that there are a number of ways and a number of companies that solely just do compliance related to blockchain or blockchain analysis. But I mean, what is nice, and you think about it sort of Bank Secrecy Act 2.0, if you think of the blockchain as this open and distributed transaction ledger, it actually is a lot more transparent than, say, like cash transactions. So there are ways in which to examine the blockchain where you can find suspicious transactions. So think about if you went to the bank or you went to the corner store or something and you gave them $10 and you asked for 2 5s, that's probably a normal transaction. If you went and asked for 10 dimes, 5 1s, something like that, that's kind of weird, right? So the blockchain, because again it's open, there are ways to analyze and find suspicious patterns like that you know, mentioned tumblers and other things where you know, there might be sort of nefarious things going on. I think secondly, again, you know, there are ways in which you can identify different addresses. And again, it's a global, I've said this before, but because it's a global open access system, you know, we have our wallets that we host and provide for, and we sort of identify. And we can kind of control in a certain way. So we can identify if certain addresses perhaps are associated with dark markets or child pornography sites. You know, if we identify that some of our users are perhaps sending value to those wallets, you know, we can take action, work with law enforcement to identify. So I guess overall, you know, the blockchain actually and this distributed ledger actually presents a lot of really kind of exciting opportunities to kind of develop new techniques for investigation and compliance.
Thank you.
Mike Nelson, Cloudflare, also with Georgetown University. You've mentioned some of the states that are doing things that are problematic. Are there any countries that are doing the right thing to foster digital money? Are there any examples you would point to? Or is the U.S. so far ahead in this that we're going to be the digital superpower of digital money?
Well, I think the failed states are probably the best bet because you know, that's where I think digital money has their you know, most opportunity at the moment.
And John mentioned the UK, which is actually investing some money, some actual government money into funding research. That's a very nice symbol, and we may actually achieve some real results. As far as the developing world, one interesting, and this is sort of down the road. Don't expect this to be around tomorrow, but I know that there's a company called Factum that has actually been working with the Honduras government in order to try and get property registries onto a blockchain. Again, the blockchain which underpins Bitcoin and which tells you who has which Bitcoins, and that's how it's an open access system, is you can always query that ledger. It's just an append-only spreadsheet to really drastically simplify it. And the other great append-only spreadsheet in the Anglo-Saxon common law is the registry of deeds at your county clerk house. So you can see, I can see, so my parents recently bought a house. I can see that in the 1800s was the first time that the plat was actually outlined. It was transferred from James to Johnson to, you know, Culpeper to et cetera, and all the way up to Van Valkenburgh to my parents, and it's very exciting. You could do that with a blockchain, and it would be an open system that would be cryptographically verifiable, so that it really maybe puts some bulwarks in place against corruption of people in the bureaucracy that would otherwise want to manipulate those records for their own private gain. So the public sort of civic coding aspects of the future of this technology are very encouraging, and I do think you could see in the developing world a quicker uptake of that. Also, remittances are such a massive potential, probably much closer term app that I think you might see states that are trying to encourage that because it's a great way to get capital into their economies.
All the way in the back. Wait for the microphone. Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Is this on? Whatever, there we go. Jeremy Pesner, I'm a GSA. I missed a big chunk of the middle here because I somehow thought it was a good idea to only order 3 pizzas. So apologies if I missed anything that's relevant to what I'm about to ask. There's a large portion of the world that doesn't have adequate access to IT knowledge and infrastructure. So I would have trouble imagining that Bitcoin could really make inroads there as their primary source of currency. Not to mention that money also has a lot of cultural significance. You know, we have a lot of important, you know, world leaders and other things on money. So in my mind, I doubt that I would imagine Bitcoin like supplanting money as we know it entirely. Do you see Bitcoin, though, as more of a way, as was sort of described as a sort of currency, a way that money can relate to one another, a way to transfer money more easily? A sort of, how do you see Bitcoin living alongside money as we know it?
And I basically view Bitcoin as a payment system. It's a way of transferring value from one person to another. It doesn't have to be in a virtual currency. You can use the technology of the Bitcoin payment network. You can use the blockchain to transfer real estate, stocks, or dollars. I think it would be a great idea if the U.S. Federal Reserve were to issue U.S. dollars in bit form. And I think that would go a long way to alleviating a lot of the problems that Bitcoin 1.0 has.
I actually would have to disagree somewhat gently with that. So as a ledger, the blockchain is this technology that could be used to, say, trade stocks, like what the NASDAQ proposal is. However, as a network and an open protocol, it's really a complicated system of incentives designed to get people to behave honestly when they process transactions on behalf of other people. And a key part of that is the blockchain, which we've talked about, which is this transparent ledger, which as a technology, we imagine we could use to create open ledgers, so you don't have to rely on Bank of America's closed atomistic ledger and its interactions with others. You just have one big one, just like you have one big internet, and generally sending data through that is homogeneous. What you build on top of it is different. But the blockchain cannot exist without the incentive structure to reward participants to actually behave honestly. And that reward structure is giving those who process transactions faithfully, who obey the rules that the protocol has set down for what mathematically equals, 2 + 2 = 4, not something else, not fraud, reward them with something that the protocol natively understands. And right now it rewards them with bitcoins. So I think the currency concept is more on the money. You're not going to, it's difficult to conceive of a system that would be pure blockchain without some token that is native to the blockchain, rewarding and incentivizing people to behave honestly. Because that's the beauty of the system.
But what's going to happen once all the current Bitcoins are mined? So we have to, eventually, we'll go to a system where instead of getting new Bitcoins, you basically have transaction fees. And we're already seeing, if you look at most Bit wallets, you can put in a little transaction fee to get your transaction processed a little bit faster. So eventually we will be going to a transaction fee-based model. It's just a question of when. And once you do that, you can have the transaction fee in any currency, not just Bitcoin.
Yeah, as far as the scalability question, it is difficult. So if all 7 or 8 billion people decided to start using the Bitcoin system and the network as it was right now, fees would have to skyrocket or the network would collapse. And probably both would happen, but fortunately these things happen fairly slowly. What I think we can see here, though, is that on a certain level we have these things that underpin systems and they have value. And then we often hypothecate on top of that. So even in traditional monetary systems, you originally had gold, and we hypothecate assets on top of gold, and eventually you maybe end up with a system that's completely divorced from the real asset, and that's a fiat system. But you can build on top of these things. The real key to Bitcoin is that it's an open network. It's open source software. You can go to a GitHub repository and look at the whole darn thing, and you can go to the blockchain and a blockchain explorer and look at the whole darn registry of transactions that have been used with the whole thing. And that creates a system that people can build things on top of. So if you need a more scalable platform, you build that. You become the Google on top of the internet. But when you need to reconcile, when you need to access accounts that aren't from your customers, they're from someone else's customers, you have this open, no gateway, no gatekeeper network to do that reconciliation.
So I disagree with you in the sense that if you look at M-Pesa in Kenya, which is essentially mobile minutes, it turns into a significant chunk of their GDP. There's no face of a president on this. It's essentially what was useful to them is what made the currency sort of take off. So we've, this is Bill Schaefer, Epoch with a K. We've built a SMS-based Bitcoin wallet. So our focus is sort of the O4B, the other 4 billion people that have feature phones that can make use of this digital technology. And but my question is, actually, I'm fascinated with, I'm also the meetup leader for Ethereum. If you want to kind of see the future of development of technology, check that out. And so being, for this audience, I'd like to sort of put a broad question. How do you think that this whole concept of decentralized computing will affect internet commerce in the sense that most of the internet is, Google's not free, right? They get your data and they monetize that. How does a decentralized peer-to-peer computing technology, how does that change the internet? What happens to hosting companies? What happens to server farms? What happens to microtransactions? And when this crypto economic protocol is more widely available to people? I guess I'd throw that to whoever is most interested in that.
So I can somewhat speak to that more from the Bitcoin specific component, not necessarily from the broader futuristic, fully decentralized computing in general. But what we see, so when we first saw Bitcoin really start to emerge, from law enforcement, it's certainly concerning of its individuals really being able to engage in peer-to-peer transactions on a very broad basis. But what we found is that people still want the convenience of a financial service. So your average person, they're not keeping cash stored under their mattress, they're keeping cash in the bank. They want the convenience of ready access to their funds. They want the ability to not have to deal with the risk of holding the funds themselves. Even with this decentralized system, we still see a lot of centralization in the services that have emerged around it, where you have companies like Coinbase and many of the others in the ecosystem, where it's decentralized, but there are still centralized components that have sprung up all around this decentralized ecosystem, such that there's this push toward decentralization, but a lot of the mainstream consumer base that we've seen, at least, just isn't really there yet, even from a convenience sake.
Oh.
Go ahead.
Well, just quickly, as far as the sort of future-looking sort of concept, so we think that Bitcoin will really succeed one day when everyone's using it, but nobody knows that they're using it. So it sort of becomes a seamless web of payment solutions for all the things you need. And one area where you can see a real promise there is, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Google's Project Fi. It's very exciting. They've created this virtual SIM card, effectively, that will sit in your phone, and it will negotiate, for the first iteration of the Google Fi project, it'll negotiate between T-Mobile and, I believe, Sprint to find the better connection, or maybe a Wi-Fi router to find the best connection to route your data over that time. Now, that is a really great market innovation in the sense that you don't have to rely on one single provider to build an end-to-end network that will always support your needs, and then you don't have to worry about the natural monopoly problem that could come, potentially, from having such a singular large power dealing with connectivity. Now, what we could get that would be even better than Project Fi would be a virtual SIM that could incrementally, through microtransactions, negotiate with all of the major carriers and say, we've got a customer waiting here who's got a device that's capable of connecting to all of your networks. Who's got the best price for this megabyte? And then that transaction has to happen machine to machine, and it has to happen with low transaction fees. And machine-to-machine payments need an asset that computers can understand, which would be something like a cryptocurrency, and with low fees, like a cryptocurrency. So that could be very exciting.
All right, so you got the microphone, and then here, and then up here.
My name is Ben Kosh. I'm a student at the University of Notre Dame. So one question I'd ask any of you guys, I'm sure you know more about this than I do. How do you view Bitcoin evolving in light of the developments in mining, particularly? Obviously, the Bitcoin reward for mining is going down. And we see also, interestingly, that there's been this centralization of the mining capabilities to achieve that economy of scale with China, with the implicit energy subsidies that they're receiving, and in Iceland with their geothermal facilities. How can the system adapt and avoid, they're commonly talked about 51% attack. I know Columbia Computer Science was talking about you could even theoretically destabilize the network with a smaller percentage of the share. And additionally, alongside that, with the growth of these mining pools. So how can the network evolve so that can remain stable in light of this centralization?
Anybody have thoughts on that?
You want to take that?
Do I want to take that?
No.
Well, I just want to point
I'm
out
happy to
that
take
fears like this are one of the challenges that Bitcoin has to overcome. That new technologies have new flaws, many of which are unappreciated at the very beginning. And indeed, the notion of, the miners will never do anything to harm Bitcoin because then they'd lose money. Well, here's another nightmare scenario that I'll throw out. Once you build a financial system around Bitcoin, it'll be possible to borrow Bitcoin. In other words, to be short Bitcoin. So what would stop somebody from taking borrowing a huge amount of Bitcoin and then doing something to manipulate the whole network to try to cause a crash in the price of Bitcoin so that they could then exit their short position at a profit? So you're raising some serious issues here, and I'd love to hear what the solutions are, because I think this is a serious challenge to widespread adoption of Bitcoin.
Yeah, so there are some interesting developments that I would just quickly add to that. I think you're right, absolutely, that we're seeing a very young technology, and there will be challenges and road bumps and changes. But to put some tangibles there, there's always the possibility that you rework the consensus algorithm. So this is going to get kind of complicated. So I'll try to do a broad overview. So the reason why mining needs to happen is because you want to, as I said, incentivize people to faithfully reproduce process transactions, rather. And you need to give them some kind of reward for that. And you also need to make it costly. If it's easy to just write to the public ledger, it's easy to commit fraud potentially on the public ledger. You need to create an incentive structure that's difficult. And that's why the electricity is as costly as it is because we need people to actually compete by doing some work in some way that we can measure. And solving these cryptographic hash functions is something we can measure. Generally, outside of Iceland's beautiful cold weather and their geothermic pools, it's hard to really game that system because you're going to spend a certain amount of electricity and generate a certain amount of heat in order to solve this problem, which will then earn you access to write to the ledger. There's a few things to keep in mind. Once you have access to that ledger, you can't do anything. You can't simply rewrite everything because you can only do things that meld with the consensus rules of other miners. Now, if you're winning blocks all the time and you're always able to write to the blockchain, on a certain level, you can do a lot more. But even then, we have this record that goes back, and it's transparent. So we can see at that moment, things started to go wonky. This particular miner developed too much power and started creating these blocks that are not what we want them to be. And we as a group can identify them, exclude them from the network, and try and tweak the system so that it can't be gamed the way it was gamed before. And so I think what we have is an open source protocol that evolves, that grows, and hopefully looks and identifies those roadblocks or those problems. And if need be, and this is a bad situation, no doubt, because the price of Bitcoin would probably fall, but if need be, we roll back the clock on the blockchain and we just fix the problem.
Can you bring the microphone? Oh, you got it. Okay.
Jim Graber, representing only myself. I haven't never heard of BitDollar before tonight. I've heard a lot about Bitcoin, but not BitDollar. I'd like to ask about Bitcoin and BitDollar. Who's going to win? Is BitDollar really going to emerge? If so, when? What is the future of a government-sponsored electronic money versus the open source electronic money?
Well, I think I may have coined that term.
Or dollar did.
But spread it around.
Yes, yes, and attach my name to it in the name chain so that everybody knows I think I coined it. Just like certain politicians think they may have invented the internet. But anyways, the U.S. government, like all governments, makes a huge profit printing money. And indeed, the U.S. dollar is one of the U.S. government's primary exports. That we as U.S. residents earn a lot of profits, a lot of rent from the fact that the U.S. dollar is basically used worldwide as a major currency. So, when people in unstable countries are storing money in their mattress, chances are their preferred piece of paper is one that was manufactured at the Bureau of Printing and Engraving across town. So, why not continue this product line that the U.S. exports, in digital space? Why give the rents? Why give the profits to those shadowy, unknown people who basically started Bitcoin, when it can be had by the U.S. taxpayers? I mean, that's the way I view it. So, there are a lot of advantages to having a stable stable medium as the medium of exchange. We basically lose all the volatility of Bitcoin, but we get all the advantages of the blockchain. And yes, we do have to pay the miners. There's no doubt about it. But even with the existing Bitcoin 1.0, when all the Bitcoins are mined, we have to go to a transaction fee-based system anyways. So if we're going to eventually have a transaction fee-based system, why not have one where we have the US dollar in the middle, and we let the U.S. government, and thus the taxpayers, earn the profits. That's what I think would be a really cool advance.
This will happen anytime soon?
I'm not particularly bullish about it, just under the generally I don't expect my government to build good software, and that's not because I don't love my government. It's just not comparative advantage, it's not expertise. And I think open source is really the key thing about Bitcoin that at least makes me a big believer, is that this is an iterative platform that allows anyone to innovate on top of it, that allows anyone to even offer commits to the GitHub repository, to offer suggestions at the very least, and allows anyone to hack on the platform and build a new wallet. And if you had some sort of pseudo-centralized solution that was developed by a government research program and sanctioned by the Federal Reserve, I have trouble seeing how it would remain an open ecosystem. I have trouble seeing how other states would see that, and I have trouble seeing how it would be maintained without a vibrant developer community.
Yeah, I mean, and just to go back to Jim's point, I mean, I think, or maybe it was Peter's, I think you're going to get to a point where you're not going to know necessarily that you're even dealing with Bitcoin. You're just going to enjoy the benefits of sort of that open payment system. It's like, why didn't the government create another SMTP? It's because they had SMTP. I mean, I'm a Democrat, but like, I live on 8th Street and they haven't got that streetcar done in like 10 years. I don't expect them to build a new open source Bitcoin network anytime soon. I do think, I think you're always going to have to pay your taxes in dollars. Now, if you're a city and you are in a lot of budgetary trouble, like most of our U.S. cities are, and you make a lot of money off your parking fines or your parking tickets or other sort of small, depending on what city you're in, amounts of money, I think using at some point a payment system like Bitcoin that lowers the fees that they have to pay actually is a real benefit to taxpayers, because that's money that's going back into the coffers of government where they otherwise would have to take it from taxpayers. So I think that's kind of an application where you're going to see some benefits to taxpayers, as you mentioned, maybe not necessarily on the transaction piece.
Hi. I have a question specifically to a point you made, but I think it's open to the audience.
Speak a little louder.
Hi. So my question is to do with a point. I'm sorry, I forget your name. You made a point about protecting people who do software, that works with the blockchain. I remember there was an incident about a year ago where I think there have been a couple, but I think a really famous one was this company called the ESEA. They help people find Counter-Strike matches. In their client that is free to download, they smuggled in a mining enslaver, and they got caught. And it was like they got fined, but I think your comment towards like saying, well, software, as long as they don't hold funds, that seemed like a weird comment, seeing that that this thing is very exploitable in a lot of ways that we can't think of. So, and I think, and my last point I want to make is I feel like there's a growing sense where the term Internet of Things is thrown around a lot, where there's going to be way more processors, there'll be way more computers around everywhere. Or crimes like that, like if we like blanket don't deal with that seems like a very real problem.
No,
so
it's an excellent question, and I'm glad you asked it, because I should be more clear. When I said what we're looking for when it comes to custody of funds and regulation was the very narrow issue of state consumer protection regulation that is iterating on top of the traditional money transmission regime. So Western Union has to obey certain rules about how much money they keep on hand and how they can always make good on their promises to transmit money on behalf of customers. That's a very particular type of regulation, and that's the type of regulation that's called licensing. It's not that they can be sued at the end of the day if they do something bad. It's that they're not even allowed to operate a business until they go to someone like Benjamin Losky in New York State and ask him for permission to start the business. So that's a very specific type of regulation, and that's the kind of regulation that I think is too strong of a touch when it comes to people who don't hold custody of funds. Now, to your point, putting mining slave software in something that you offer to people and you're not transparent about it, that of course would be a public problem that we need a public goods provider to resolve. And so there's certainly a role for government there. I wouldn't question that at all. And actually, we have existing laws that would do a pretty good job. At least these are the laws that we've actually used, and that's things like unfair and deceptive practices. So you presented a product that said it would do one thing, and the FTC comes back and says that, no, it didn't actually. Yeah, maybe it did some of that, but it also ran up their electrical bill because it was suddenly a Bitcoin miner that was sending Bitcoins to somebody else. And they say, sorry, can't do that. maybe you even violated the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act because you were accessing their computing power without authorization. I'm not a big fan of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act because it's pretty draconian. It has big penalties. This is why, I am potentially bullish on the use of unfair and deceptive practices. And as I said, this is going to be an evolving regulatory regime. We also have common law. You can always sue somebody for breach of contract. You can always sue someone for tortious invasion of chattel for your computer.
So, Simpson Garfinkel, I'm here for myself. A lot of the panelists have spoken very positively about the blockchain, but you've also spoken about things like microtransactions using the blockchain. And so I'm trying to make those two things work together, because that would seem that the blockchain would get really, really big, really fast, and I don't see how that's compatible. And then you also talk about using the blockchain for what most people would consider private transactions, like person-to-person money transfer or reading a magazine article, and the blockchain's completely public. And so again, I have a hard time making those two work together, because people aren't going to want to send all their money through Mixmasters or what have you just to read an article. So yeah, it's neat technology, and it's been around for much longer than Bitcoin has, because hash chains go back 20 years. But I just don't see how it can do all these things that you say it can do. Can you explain that?
I don't mean to talk so much if anyone else wants to grab this one, but we are actually tomorrow going to release a backgrounder on our website explaining something called micropayment channels. And so the concept between a micropayment channel is a way of resolving the scalability issue. If you're buying gas by the milliliter, you can't have a blockchain inscribed transaction for each milliliter that enters your gas tank, and each, and then you would never need that kind of counterparty security. You don't think suddenly they're going to not pay you for the extra milliliter you just got. But this is basically the central problem: is how do we do metering? When you scroll down the page, do you do a transaction paying somebody for the content that they're enjoying as they read further into the blog article? You can't do that on a blockchain. You're totally right. What you can do is set up a channel, and it's like you set up this escrow lock. So you say, I'm willing to spend maybe $10 to read stuff on the internet for the next week. And I know certain content providers that I'm willing to put that towards them. We're going to lock those funds in something called a multi-sig address, which is basically, an address is a public identifier, a public key, and private keys. A multi-sig address is a public identifier with multiple private keys. So you lock this thing in something that is controlled by multiple people. You need 2 of 3 people in order to move money out of this lock. You can't just move it out yourself. So you put it in this little security lockbox, and then you actually exchange transactions off the chain, saying, all right, we know state of the world now, I've consumed this much content from you, you, and you. We're going to reconcile and sign a transaction, but we're not going to broadcast it. We'll keep this. We know that if any of us disappear, we could broadcast it, and we would reconcile as to the point where we are right now, because the cryptography works out. Then I'm going to read some more down the page, and we're all going to reconcile the new budget between you, you, and me. And we're going to sign that transaction, but not broadcast it. And we can verify, and at every point, we have a certain amount of faith in the way we've signed these messages. That means we don't have to have faith that the other person is behaving honestly in the situation. And then after maybe a week of me reading content, we've upgraded this. It's sort of like opening a tab at a bar. You had 6 drinks. You didn't pay 6 times for each drink. You had a tab. Except it's better than a tab, because the guy holding the tab can't just run away with your credit card. And so at the end of these 6 drinks at the bar, at the end of my week of reading stories on Vox, on other news sites, we settle up and we write one big transaction to the blockchain that was actually potentially thousands of microtransactions over the past week, all of my activity. As to the privacy question, this also can get to that, because you can actually do this mixing in a large sort of micropayment scheme. You sort of have a market that provides liquidity, because if there's this many people floating money to other people, you're going to need that market anyway. You reconcile in this cryptographic way before writing to the blockchain. All the blockchain sees is that these 60 content providers and Peter van Valkenburgh were involved in a rather complicated thing, And at the end of the day, he had good content, but we don't know who on the 60 providers it really was, actually, because it was all part of a multi-sig address.
Let me take a real quick survey here. This is a very internet-savvy group, probably a lot of early adopters here. How many of you are just really eager for a way to start paying for content on the web? Okay.
I'd rather do that than give all my information to Google.
Yes, and that's the trade-off.
Yep.
And all these other guys that who don't keep it safe from people who
Yes.
can then take my identity and do all kinds of bad stuff to me.
And also, paywalls as they exist right now only work if you're Wall Street Journal. If I put a paywall on my blog, people are going to say, have fun with that, Peter. You're going to be the only reader. And that's because Wall Street Journal says, you're buying a paywall, you're buying access through a paywall to all of our things. And we don't care once you're in that world. It's a walled garden. You can read all the things. But without these walled gardens, if it's just my blog and your blog and your blog and your blog, how can we establish the kind of network effects to get someone to actually buy into a payment network? You can't. You need an open payment protocol. You need Bitcoin.
Any more questions?
Can we get the mic, please?
I think we have these two, and then I think that'll be it.
Hello, and I just want to say thank you. This has been a fascinating presentation. Question, I suppose, for the lady from the FBI. There's been a story in the news lately. I'm not going to mention any names, but I'm sure everyone's familiar with it, of a fellow who was caught paying hush money was caught by repeatedly withdrawing money from the bank right below the $10,000 limit. Had he been paying through Bitcoin, would any sort of alarms have gone off the way the system is constructed now, or is that something that needs to be addressed in the future?
It would depend on which exchange he was pulling the money out of, to be honest. Different exchanges have different procedures in place. The U.S. exchanges that have built out compliance programs should see that, but there's actually a misconception about what that $10,000 requirement is, and it applies for cash withdrawals, which normally wouldn't apply to our exchanges that aren't usually dealing in direct cash, but sometimes it still is a red flag because it looks as though someone's trying to evade a reporting requirement, even though there's no real reporting requirement there for them to evade.
And when you say exchanges, you mean a group like Coinbase, is it?
Right. So in the U.S., basically, the entities where our compliance obligations, different BSA obligations come into play is normally in the exchange function where there's some money transmission occurring.
Thank you.
All right. We got one. No, here. This gentleman had his hand raised.
Yeah, quick follow-up.
Okay.
Wouldn't that anonymous former Speaker of the House still have to withdraw the money from his bank account to buy the Bitcoin from Coinbase?
Right, so this is where the question of where the actual reporting obligation is that comes into play. Hypothetically, in any transaction like this, not commenting on any particular activity, but different players in the ecosystem may actually have different but also overlapping reporting obligations for that type of transaction. So the bank, if it's pulled out in cash, will have an obligation to report that cash, to collect some information about the cash withdrawal, but if it's a red flag that's triggered related to an anti-money laundering program, the different companies may or may not, depending on the other red flags that have also been triggered related to the customer, have a reporting obligation.
And just for Coinbase specifically, again, I don't know the exact facts of that specific case, but we do file SARs, suspicious activity reports, to FinCEN. And so to the extent that that case or other cases raise red flags that cause us to think it is suspicious activity, we do file those reports with Treasury.
All right, I guess I have the last question. So we've kind of made some references to parallels between the development of the internet and development of Bitcoin as an open platform for development. On the internet and the web, a lot of innovations at least started in an academic setting, and we've kind of talked about how maybe there's a shortcoming in research. You mentioned the UK putting money towards it. I'm wondering where is the Academy in the United States in thinking about development of Bitcoin specifically, blockchain technology, cryptocurrencies in general, and is there interest or interesting work going on? Any contribution from the Academy?
Well, I guess as an academic, I'm a token academician here. I've published a scholarly article on the ethics of payments, including Bitcoin, and there are hundreds of papers and working papers that cover little bits and pieces of it, but I don't see any coordinated research effort underway. You have the crypto people in computer sciences, you have various economist types like myself, you've got a number of people who've gotten bitten by the urge to investigate further, but again, I don't see any concentrated research focus.
Yeah, I think there has been a dearth of sort of like, centralized, if you will, sort of academic work on this. You've had sort of piecemeal folks across the country at different universities and such that have done some work. I will say something that we're excited about is the MIT Media Lab, actually just a few weeks ago, I think, announced that they've been doing some work related to Bitcoin and digital currencies in general. But a gentleman by the name of Brian Ford, who's actually formerly of the White House, is now leading sort of a digital currency initiative there at MIT. I think with the idea to kind of deal with sort of centralize, I guess, if you will, sort of some of the academic research and foster, through scholarships and other ways, some thinking, not only at MIT, but I think across the country and globe. So we're really, it just kind of got started, and we're kind of excited to see sort of where that goes.
Yeah. It's very exciting. They've also already brought on some of the core developers of the protocol, so that these people who maintain a reference client, which is sort of your read this in order to build your own Bitcoin thing basis, those people will be, some of them will be paid from an academic institution, and they'll have the wealth of network effects that come with that. And scholarly research, I'm sure, will follow.
All right. Thank you all for coming.